Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. That's right, this is a board game podcast that focuses on board game discussion and board game reviews, but without the frills and pomps of rules explanations. It is a hot, muggy end of summer day outside today, which means it's a great day to stay inside, play some board games, or do what I'm doing, talking to my wall. This week's going to follow our normal agenda. I'm going to talk about some games I've played recently or some gaming experiences I've had. Then we're going to move on to the feature game of the week, which is Arkham Horror 2nd Edition, but with a focus on playing it solo. This is the third week of the month after all. On the third week of the month, we like to focus on solo games, which is something that you would know if I had recorded more than 2 episodes so far. As always, don't forget, we don't discuss rules here, so if you'd like to know more about the rules of any of the games I'm talking about today, please feel free to check the description of this video or of this podcast. I'll be placing links in that description that talks more about how these games are played and goes more in depth into the rules. But that having been said, let's move on to some games I played. It's been an exciting time around here actually. A big box arrived at my front door earlier this week, and I opened it up and found Gloomhaven. That's right, get those slowpoke memes ready because I have only just now started playing Gloomhaven. I'm only a few years behind the curve, but you know what they say. You should play Gloomhaven. Overall, I've actually been enjoying the experience quite a bit, which really shouldn't be surprising because the game's won more awards than Babe Ruth hit home runs. I really appreciate the way it nails the aesthetic of a dungeon crawler, but has a very interesting Euro type hand management system that kind of drives your interactions with the game itself. Overall, I can absolutely see why people recommended it. And one thing I particularly appreciate is I appreciate the way that it's really easy to drop players in or out of the game. In the few other experiences I have with legacy games, it hasn't been that way. I've played through I can't remember what it's called now, Charterstone. And Charterstone boasted a streamlined method for allowing players to drop in and out. But in our experience, it wasn't actually as functional as the game wanted or pretended it to be. But Gloomhaven is really very simple. It's just a matter of changing the setup for each individual scenario. Really, the only downsides I'm seeing so far is I find the story to be somewhat forgettable, and character progression is not quite where I'd prefer. Uh, all things considered, it's actually pretty impressive considering how much content is in the box, how many character classes you have to unlock. So I can't criticize it on it being too light on character progression. As someone coming from the background of something like Arkham Horror, the card game, where you have a really strong sense of ownership over a character as you progress through a campaign and start to buy those juicy high experience cards, the upgrade options for Gloomhaven feel a little bit lackluster. But again, as I said, considering how much content is in the box, what they've actually managed to include is really quite impressive. And so, while that's a very, very minor negative point for me, I would never knock a final score for that. We've only played through the first 8 scenarios or so, and I assume this changes as you progress through the campaign, but it feels like a lot of the scenario end criteria are very samey. Kill all the monsters, reveal a room and kill all the monsters, and kill all the monsters are the objectives that we have seen so far. I assume that's probably going to change later. But again, even if it doesn't, I don't know if I would necessarily get tired of that, especially as you're unlocking new classes and learning new play styles. A lot of that joy comes from kind of learning the nuances of the character you're playing and less about some new, flashy, here's how you beat this scenario kind of rule set. That's something that I think Arkham Horror does very well, but you know what? We'll talk about that on a later date. And in closing, that was Gloomhaven, designed by Isaac Childress and published by, I don't think I've ever tried to pronounce that name, Cephalofair Games. I also had a chance to play Bärenpark, which is an adorable little tile laying game. It's designed by Phil Walker Harding and is published by Lookout Games, at least here in the US. And the theme to Bärenpark might be kind of a conundrum to Americans because, as far as I know, we don't have bear parks here in America. Please correct me if I'm wrong. We have zoos and aquariums and things like that. But bear parks are far more common in Europe and in the UK. But theme aside, I enjoy Bärenpark in that it is light, it is quick, it's easy to pick up and play, easy to teach. But I hate Bärenpark because I'm bad at it. And so, no, I don't really actually hate it, but I am bad at spatial puzzles. And so it's a game that constantly frustrates me. One, because I'm bad at it, and two, because I feel like I'm always just one step behind everybody else at the table, even if I'm going first or second, which I guess actually in retrospect is also just me being bad at the game. I actually enjoy the puzzly aspect, the Tetris aspect of trying to figure out how to place each shape on your board to maximize your gains, kind of like patchwork. But if I had to list my biggest complaint, it's with the objectives that kind of drive the narrative of the game. Bärenpark is one of those games that's very straightforward and very simple. Because of that, the objectives that you play with basically inform the decisions that you're going to be making during the game. You have a set of objectives that you're trying to accomplish. Because actions you take over the game are so incredibly simple, there's really nothing else to do than to just try to achieve one of the objectives to score some extra points. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it was kind of an issue I have with Dinosaur Island as well. I like it when a game gives me freedom to explore and try different things, and then reward me with objectives that come with trying those new things, with trying new avenues and new paths towards victory. Baron Park isn't one of those games because realistically, it doesn't matter which objectives you're playing with, you're still doing the same thing every time you play. You're picking up tiles, you're placing them on your board, and then you're expanding the size of your board. Now, I say that as if it's a negative thing, and in my mind, it is probably my biggest criticism. But again, this is a light and it's a simple game, so that doesn't impact it too poorly. And I haven't had a chance to play with the expansion that might change things up a little bit. So as a whole, I think it's a fine, enjoyable little light, almost not quite filler, but close to there. But it's not a game that I'd be pulling out all the time to play. And so, yeah, that was Bärenpark. Lastly, I had the opportunity to play Call to Adventure The Stormlight Archive, which is a standalone expansion to Call to Adventure, a game that was kickstarted back in 2019. This is a version of the game that was released just within the last couple months or so, and it's focused around the Stormlight Archive series written by Brandon Sanderson. Now, I've played Call to Adventure several times before. It's one of my wife's favorite games, and I can see why. Similar to a game like Castles of Mad King Ludwig, the game is less about being competitive and winning and more about building something interesting. In Castles of Mad King Ludwig, you're building a unique castle that has its own peculiarities and idiosyncrasies, and at the end of the game, you can look and see who won the game, but usually you also just kind of look down your castle and think, oh, I lost, but I made this strange thing, which is fun. Call to Adventure follows a similar aesthetic where it doesn't often matter who wins, it's more about the narrative that you told for your character. It's seeing how they started off in their lives, the trials they went through, then how they ended, whether they were a grand hero or a terrible tyrant or something like that. Call to Adventure, the Stormlight Archive kind of turns things on its head a little bit. And before I keep going, I should note that the designers are Chris O'Neill and Johnny O'Neill, and it's published by Brotherwise Games. Call to Adventure, the Stormlight Archive, turns things on its head in that it seems to be primarily designed to be played co op, which is interesting because the rules don't necessarily indicate that that's its primary play mode. There were a number of cards that our group went through that were clearly targeted towards that co op play. They would say things like, get a minor benefit by playing this card, or play it on another player and give them a much greater benefit, which naturally is not something you want to do in a competitive or somewhat competitive game. Which again, this is not the most competitive experience out there, or at least it hasn't been the way that we've played it. There were cards like this in the original version of Call to Adventure, but usually they would say things like gain an advantage and then provide something to another player that may or may not benefit them depending on what they're trying to do. That wasn't the case here. A lot of the cards are very obviously geared towards take a small little benefit to yourself or give somebody a much greater benefit. We haven't had a chance to go back and play it co op yet, and so I'm interested in revisiting it and trying it that way. But as a whole, our group finished the game and really were kind of disappointed in it from a quotation marks competitive standpoint. We'll definitely try it again in co-op and in competitive, but so far first impressions are that the base game is far better played in the competitive way, and the Stormlight Archive version is much better played co-op, or at least seems to be geared towards playing co-op. I can't actually speak as to whether it's better that way because we haven't had a chance to play it yet. So more on that later. I think I'd like to do a full review on it at some point, and also have the opportunity to talk a little bit about Call to Adventure itself. And so more on that probably down the pipeline. And that was Call to Adventure, the Stormlight Archive, published by Brotherwise Games. And now on to the feature game of the day, which is Arkham Horror 2nd Edition, with a focus on playing solo. This is a game designed by Richard Launius and Kevin Wilson, and it's published by Fantasy Flight Games. Now, I know some of you out there are probably asking, why are you reviewing the second edition of Arkham Horror when there's a newer version out? Well, the answer to that's quite simple. I own the second edition, but I don't own the third edition. And as much as I'd be interested in trying the third edition, I don't know if that's going to be something I'll have access to anytime soon, as I already own not just the second edition, but all the large box and small box expansions to it. That in some way might serve as an introduction to how I feel about the game, which is I really quite like Arkham Horror, but I like it in a very niche way that I hope I can make clear as I talk about it a little bit more. Arkham Horror is one of the earliest games I purchased in my foray into designer board games. In fact, I probably purchased it way too early on. I remember opening it up for the first time and just kind of marveling at all the pieces and how big the rule book was and how many rules there were. And I remember thinking for a long time that it's a very complicated and heavy experience. And now that I think about it, it had been 5 or 6 years since I'd last played the game before I pulled it out to play some solo games with it during all the COVID craziness when we were all locked in our homes. So it was funny to open up Arkham Horror for the first time in 4 or 5 years, or 6 years, or however many it was, and realize that the game is not nearly as complex or nearly as heavy or even maybe even nearly as difficult as I had once thought it was. Now, this is, of course, speaking as somebody that's had now 10-ish years of playing medium to heavy Euros. So I suppose it's only natural that I would find a game of this ilk far less complex than I would have at the beginning of my run into designer board games. Let me start off talking about the game itself by saying this. Arkham Horror has an epic, vast feeling to it. It's also really kind of stupid. It's a game where the decisions you make are really very simple, but there's so much content to go through, especially as you start adding expansions to the game, that you feel like there's a lot more going on than there really is. But that's not a bad thing, especially from a solo perspective. In fact, I think it actually improves the solo game. The thinkier a game gets, the harder it can be to play solo. That can be for a couple reasons. Oftentimes because there's many more components you have to manipulate by yourself, or because in a game like Arkham Horror, where you're wanting to play multiple characters at the same time, it kind of gives brain overload, where there's too much to be considering on every player's turn that you just can't keep track of it all. In Arkham Horror, that's not really the case. If anything, the downside of playing multiple characters is you need a really big table to properly do it. Each of my playthroughs were with 4 investigators, and I have a really big table that I play on. I just about took up the entire table. The board itself is, of course, not small. There's 15, 16 decks, maybe more, that have to be put out onto the table. And then you've got each character, and you're going to want to lay out the cards that are available to that player, their items, their money, things like that. And so when you lay it all on the table, it's really quite impressive. But the important thing is that each character on their turn is really taking a set of very basic actions. They're moving, or they're not. They're fighting, or they're not. And then they draw a card and they resolve some text. That's essentially the most that any character does throughout the game. And so, turn by turn, it really becomes a simple matter as you start to get into the flow of the game of not just planning ahead in what you want to do, but moving quickly from investigator to investigator and making turns go extremely quickly. In fact, that's, in my opinion, one of the big advantages of playing Arkham Horror 2nd Edition solo, is it drastically reduces not just the downtime, but the playtime. This isn't a game that had a ton of downtime to begin with. One of the things I appreciated about Arkham Horror when I first started playing it is that everyone kind of takes their turn at the same time. But during the encounter phase, it can get really quite dull to be waiting for someone else to read their encounter before you get to read yours. Or if you go first, you have to wait for everybody else at the table to resolve their encounters before you can move on. And this isn't a 3 or 4 player game. The game supposedly plays up to 8 players, which sounds like a nightmare. I cannot imagine playing this game with more than 4. And honestly, after playing it solo and then playing with the group afterward, I don't think I can imagine playing this game with anybody else at all. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. But while I didn't ever feel that downtime was too big of an issue for Arkham Horror, the playtime always has been. A big part of that can be remedied by having everybody read their objective cards to themselves and then resolve them. But even if you're adopting that kind of a rule, it still takes a long time to play. There's deliberation around the table, there's rolling dice, there's people checking rules, doing things like that. And I found that the more I played solo, the quicker and quicker I was able to get through the game, to the point where I could finish the solo game in sometimes 45 minutes to an hour. And that's winning the game, not just losing really quickly. I think part of that is because I don't have anybody to deliberate with. I'm making all the decisions myself. And frequently, if I'm playing the game by myself with 4 investigators, I already know what I want an investigator to do over the next couple turns. I know what side of the board I want them to get to. I know where I want them to be taking actions or moving into open gates or things like that. And so that was another big bonus I found was that reduced playtime. Another thing that kind of stood out to me during my solo plays of Arkham Horror Second Edition is how much strategy there actually is in the game. I remembered it being very random and very unfair, very difficult to win. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of randomness, there's plenty of luck, there's a lot of dice rolling, and it is difficult still. But as I was playing the game solo, I found that there's more game there than I remembered there being. There's a very puzzly aspect to Arkham Horror, which isn't apparent right away. And that comes from having an idea for what options are available to you from the beginning as you're building your team, and then executing. So, what I found really quite enjoyable was setting up the game, selecting Elder God, selecting what expansion, if I wanted to include an expansion in the game, setting it all up, and then going through my investigators and carefully picking a team that would be able to ideally handle any situation that the board or that the game threw at me. And when I started thinking of the game that way, I really started to enjoy it more and more. It reminded me more and more of a competent squad based RPG, where sometimes the game was less about turn by turn actions and more about proper preparation and going in with a plan. Now, with that all being said, there are definitely some cons to Arkham Horror Second Edition, and particularly in playing solo player. The biggest one being setup and takedown is a pain. If you're going to include any of the expansions, setting that up can be a pain. Remembering the rules is a pain. You have to shuffle the decks together. So yeah, spending 30 minutes setting up is a real pain. And that's in my mind probably a conservative estimate. It's not just a matter of setting everything up and starting playing, it's setting everything up and then choosing your Elder God and getting those special conditions for the Elder God set up, getting your character set up, uh, finally, and then before you take your first turn, again, yeah, about 30 minutes. If you're one of those lucky people that I envy so greatly that have a game table that you can keep a game out in, then takedown might be less of an issue. Luckily, we had access to an old pool table that we've given away since then, and I was able to leave the game out and play 6, 7 times in a row over the course of a few days without having to tear everything down. And if you can do something like that, then it makes the game a little bit easier to take down, obviously. But it also allows you to kind of test the waters of different team compositions, different expansion compositions, different elder gods, things like that. The other biggest con, and this isn't just in the solo game, this is an American game or an Ameritrash game, if that's what you prefer to call it. And so anybody that doesn't like those kinds of games, that don't like a ton of dice rolling, that don't like randomness, that don't like things that they can't control, this probably isn't a game for you. With that being said, generally cooperative games tend to be high in randomness anyway. But to return to a point that I kind of talked about before, where I said I don't think I'd play this with other people again. I played this game solo, I want to say about 8 or 9 times, and really quite enjoyed myself. And I enjoyed it so much that my wife said, well, let's pull it out during a game night and let's play it with a group. And so we did. And I guess I can't speak for everybody else, but I thought it was a slog. It took us 3 hours to get through, and there were 4 of us that have all played the game before. And we played where everybody reads their encounters at the same time and just kind of resolves them, but still took way, way longer than it does solo. And I don't think this game in a multiplayer setting is worth that time commitment. There are many other games out there that I'd much rather play, like, I've already spoken about Spirit Island. I think that's one that I'd much rather bring out with 3 or 4 players and play cooperatively than Arkham Horror. But with that being said, I really, really enjoyed my time playing this game solo. And anyone that's looking for a grand, narrative, difficult game to play by themselves, this is one that's definitely worth checking out. It's an older game, and you can get copies of it used for like $20 on the Board Game Geek market. I saw several listings like that, and so it's not expensive to get into. I don't know how it compares to the third edition, but overall, if anything I've talked about sounds interesting to you, I'd absolutely recommend giving it a look through. Watch a couple videos on how it's played. I think a lot of people would be surprised at kind of the puzzlier aspects and how much this game has to offer when playing solo. But that's it, only playing solo. Well, thank you for listening to Learn Your Own Rules, the podcast. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free to email me at learnyourownrules@gmail.com, or you can tweet me at LYORules. As always, it is Friday, and so I hope you go on, have a great weekend, and get a lot of gameplays in. As we say here, game on. Thank you for listening to the Learn Your Own Rules podcast. This podcast is created, produced, directed, and edited by Ryan Krim. Please send help.